Okay, Brian, let's just dive right on in. This is our stacking up feature. It's Notre Dame's offense versus Florida State's defense. This is a I'll say pretty good. Yeah, solid side of things for Notre Dame last year. And I would say definitely a weakness for Florida State last year as well.
Certainly.
I'm trying to be nice, trying to be kind, right? But this was an area where Notre Dame was very successful, especially against Florida State. What is it going to look like this year? That is the question. Can Notre Dame get better than they were last year? Can they go from solid to really good to great? And is there room for, well, of course there's room for Florida State to get better, but there's also room for them to get worse. Not as much room. The arrow has to be pointing up for Florida State, I would imagine. Right. But that is what we are going to talk about today, Brian. And we're going to go in order. We're going to start with the rush offense. Then we're going to talk about the pass offense for Notre Dame, and then we're going to talk about overall offense versus defense. We're going to break it down all the way for you.
Right. And look, this is the first, like you said, this is kind of that first test for Notre Dame. We're going to find out just how good this group can be. Now, they hung up 42 on Florida State last year. They had 353 rushing yards, took some deep shots, hit a couple deep balls in the game, but there's also a lot of sloppy play in this game. Turnovers, obviously Kyron Williams had a fumble early in the game. They didn't really put Florida State away on either side of the ball. And so this is going to be an opportunity for Notre Dame to kind of come out on the road against a quality opponent that you and I think is a bowl caliber team.
Sure.
This isn't your daddy's Florida State. We've talked about this. This isn't the Florida State you and I grew up watching. This is a program that's looking to come out of the ashes, so to speak. I think where Brian Kelly was in year two.
Yeah, right.
Right. So it's going to be a test. It is going to be a test. You've got Notre Dame coming off of a playoff appearance, Florida State coming off of a 3-6 season. This is the side of the ball that has to get a lot better for Florida State, and this is the side of the ball that has to get better for Notre Dame if they're going to take that next step as a program. And so you've got those two things kind of colliding in this opener. Which one's going to win? Right. And that's what. And so we're, is it a end all be all test? No. Are we going to learn some important things about both units? Yeah. I think we are.
Oh, and especially in game one. Look, there's no chance we get all of our questions answered from either team, right? From Notre Dame's offense or Florida State's defense. And you referenced the fact that this could be a bowl team for Florida State. I think if they make it into a bowl, that's a successful season.
Yeah, you got to double their win total from last year.
Absolutely. Yeah, you have to temper your expectations with reality, right? And this isn't the Florida State of old, right? So
sure. And Vince, we could say, hey, look, Florida State shouldn't be looking at a bowl game as a successful season. Yeah, I get that, but that's where you are. This isn't about history. This is about where you are right now. And where you are right now is that's where Florida State needs to be. Notre Dame, on the other hand, needs to make sure that, that's going to happen for you guys, but it ain't going to happen on September 5th. And then the other part too is, and we'll just briefly touch on this as we dive into it, but both of these units are going to look a lot different this year. More so personnel-wise than schematically. You look at Florida State, there's no Emmett Rice. He got hurt in the spring. He's probably going to be out for this game, last I heard. He was one of the starting linebackers. There's no Asante Samuel, who was their best cornerback last year, second-round draft pick. No Jaden Lars Woodbay. No Janarius Robinson. No Robert Kando. No Corey Darden. I mean, there's no Marvin Wilson, right? For Notre Dame, you lose 4 starting offensive linemen. Last year, you remember, Liam Eichenberg gets knocked out of the game. He has to leave. They bring in Dylan Gibbons to replace him. He's also gone. He's now at Florida State. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But, and then no Ian Book, no Javon McKinley, no, Ben Skoranek. So there's no Tommy Trumbull, who caught a couple balls in this game last year. So both of these teams are going to look personnel-wise a lot different. And that's also something that adds a lot of intrigue to this matchup is we think Notre Dame is going to look a lot different schematically and personnel-wise. Florida State, I think, is going to look a little bit different schematically and definitely look a lot different personnel-wise. They got transfers coming in. It's going to be a fun matchup, and it's going to be our first chance to learn a lot about both of these football teams.
Yep, no question. So let's jump right in. Notre Dame's run offense versus Florida State's run defense. And I mean, obviously, we're going into week one, right? So we have the team stats from last year to kind of look at. Notre Dame obviously ran the ball very, very well. Top 12 in the country, 211 yards per game, right?
200. Your top 12 is, just so people know, is because that's not on there, is total yards.
Yes. Yeah. Total.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. So, they ran the ball pretty well. That was one of their strengths. Obviously, that was the Notre Dame's crutch, right? I mean, that's what they wanted to do.
Right.
And then Florida State, on the other hand, rush defense, they were 97th in the country. Not so good. That is correct.
And it was worse too, because you look at it, they gave up 63 yards to Jacksonville State on the ground, right? FCS opponent,
which helped them significantly.
A ton. I mean, you look at their number, 199.2. It doesn't take someone with a degree in advanced calculus to realize that jumps up well over 200 yards if you take that game out.
Right.
And so that's something else to look at. Is I'm actually kind of, me, I always get these things in my head. It jumps up to 216.3 against Power 5 opponents last year, because the rest of their opponents were Power 5 opponents. Gave up 161 to Georgia Tech, 200 to Miami, 353 to Notre Dame. We remember Kyron Williams had 2 long runs. Chris Tyree had a long run in that game. 184 to North Carolina that was a good performance actually by Florida State. I think that's a little of a misleading number. Yes, they gave up 184, which against most people, Vince, is a pretty good day for the offense. But for North Carolina, it was well under their rushing average. North Carolina last year averaged 235.8 rushing yards per game and averaged 5.8 yards per attempt. They held Florida State held them to 184 yards and 4.1, which is part of the reason Florida State won that game.
Yeah.
Then they gave up 291 to Louisville in a loss. They gave up 148 against Pitt and NC State, 2 teams that don't run the ball very well. And then they gave up 245 to Duke. So it was outside of Jacksonville State and holding North Carolina. I mean, again, that's a good performance against North Carolina.
Yeah.
Against the rest, not so much.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be a lot of new faces at it, right? And this right here, Vince, to me, is the most intriguing aspect of this new faces and new places kind of look to this matchup, right? All new offensive linemen for Notre Dame, a bunch of new faces for the Florida State front seven, and then some of the old faces are going to be in new places. So last year, for example, Amari Gaynor was a starting linebacker for Florida State last year. He was one of their top players. Had 65 tackles, which led them with 36 solo tackles last year as a sophomore. He's back. Last year, they kind of played him in this game like a rover. Didn't work. He's more of an inside guy. Well,
sure.
What I believe, based on what I saw in the spring, what I'm reading about Florida State, sounds like he's going to be back inside, which is a much better position for him. I think that's going to help their run defense. I think Jermaine Johnson, they got from the transfer from Georgia, is a solid football player. I think was more of a pass rusher at Georgia, but he's 6'5", 260. He can play the run, and they're pretty big up the middle. Robert Cooper's like 350 plus. Fabian Lovett's a really big kid. They're going to be big up the middle. That's the other part of this matchup that's interesting. So, and they got some decent athletes at linebacker. Steven Dix is probably going to be the other starter at inside linebacker. Kalen DeLoach is a guy that'll play inside. He can run a little bit. He'll also play out at that rover spot when they go to a 4-3, and that's going to be an interesting aspect of this too, Vince. Is last year they were a pure 4-3 against Notre Dame personnel wise, but they would play with that guy out in space, and that was Amari Gaynor last year. In the spring, they lined up the same way, but instead of having a linebacker in there against their own offense, they had Jamie Robinson, who is the transfer safety from South Carolina. Well, one thing that Jamie Robinson was really good at South Carolina was run defense. He is a run defender, and we'll get into that when we get into the pass game stuff. But, that's going to be a question about this matchup, Vince. Does Florida State go 4-3? Thinking Notre Dame is the same offense they were last year? Do they prepare to play Notre Dame in a 4-3 or 4-2-5 personnel, which would fit what they do? That's going to be, or do they wait to adjust to that when Notre Dame comes out and spreads the field? That's something that is intriguing about this matchup, Vince, is do they want to get more athletes on the field against Notre Dame, or are they going to try to play big boy football like they did last year, which they had a lot of 8-9-man boxes against Notre Dame, and that's why you saw big run after big run, because once you make that first line miss, there's nobody else there.
Exactly. And look, if I was a defensive coordinator and I'm going up against Notre Dame and I'm going up against an Ian Book-led Notre Dame, I'm going to stack the box too. I think that was good play. It's just they didn't execute it very well. And
they didn't have the horses to execute it.
And that's what I'm saying. Like you miss tackles, you're not in the right place. All of it, check. A team like Notre Dame is going to gash you. And that's what happened. I mean, realistically, that's what happened. And, right now, like you said, let me pull it up here. Jamie Robinson is listed as the starter at stud, right? Which is kind of like their rover, right?
Right.
And so how are they going to use him? And I think that's the big question, because if he is starting and he is a safety body and they try to put him in the box, okay, he's a good run stuffer, but then is he the one that's going to be matched up against Michael Mayer?
Right.
And
that's not how they did it. How they did it was kind of treating him more like Notre Dame used Jeremiah Wusu-Koroma. He was out in the slot.
Okay.
And so even last year they did that against Notre Dame, is they would have that at times, but it was Amari Gaynor. Yeah. And then they would bring him in. That's the question. So this year, to your point, Vince, do they leave Jamie Robinson outside and then bring him off the edge if they want to run stunt? Or do they also have some personnel when Notre Dame does go 12? Do they then put Kalen DeLoach in the game and have him play the rover? So they have two guys that they list at stud in different lineups. One is Jamie Robinson, the other is Kalen DeLoach, who's a linebacker. So it seems to me like they're trying to be able to go with a faster version of that and then a bigger version of that. That's the interesting thing, is do they go Jamie Robinson, which I think helps them on the perimeter, right? Gives them more speed on the perimeter. Or do they go with Kalen DeLoach, and who gives them more size?
Right.
And do they do that against Notre Dame's base offense?
Yeah.
What do they do when Notre Dame goes 11? What do they do when Notre Dame goes 12 and 13 personnel? Well, again, 11 is 3 receivers, 1 tight, 1 back. 12 is 2 receivers, 2 tight ends, 1 back. And so do they try to personnel match with Notre Dame?
Right.
That's going to be another question. And it's going to impact this part of the game the most.
It's really interesting because, the depth chart I'm looking at, Kalen DeLoach is listed as a will, right? Yeah. And the one you're looking at, he's listed as a stud.
Right.
So you're right. It's going to be very interesting to see how they adapt to what Notre Dame is doing, because obviously he's an inside. He's been working at inside backer, but he's also been working as kind of the rover guy, right? So, yeah, I think that this is also a way, in my opinion, for a way to Notre Dame to be successful based on the personnel that Florida State decides to put in. Again, it's going to be a chess match. Is that fair to say? Like,
yes.
Based on who Florida State puts in, like, okay, here's how we're going to match up against 12 personnel. Here's how we're going to match up against 21, whatever. And Notre Dame's like, yeah, those are the matchups we want. And then, Tommy Rees goes and does something that is going to benefit Notre Dame. That's going to be a chess match. I think that's going to be fun.
And Vince, this is kind of the thing that is the interesting part about this matchup for me, is we're going to learn a lot about just what you said. Tommy Rees's, the chess match nature of what Tommy Rees does. And in this game, he's going against Adam Fuller, who's the defensive coordinator at Florida State. The interesting part about this, he was the defensive coordinator at Memphis. He came with Mike Norvell from Memphis. So the things that I'm curious about, Vince, are, yes, the personnel chess match, but then how does Tommy Rees utilize that effectively? And for the purpose of the run game we know Notre Dame can run out of 2 tights. We know this.
Sure.
I don't expect that to change in 2021. The question, however, that we had last year, the complaint we had last year, is Notre Dame was 2 personnel. They had too many tells based on their personnel.
Sure.
Not so much they're going to run off tackle right here, but more of, we know that when they go 12 and 13, they're a run heavy team.
Right.
Can they do things in this game to balance that if Florida State tries a personnel match, which means running more out of 11 personnel than you have, and we'll get into this later, is passing more out of 12 personnel.
Right.
That'll be the interesting thing.
And I will say, and it was in the video that we shot from practice, I want to say Wednesday, that when they were doing the team takeoff, where normally we get nothing, right? They were running the 2 tight end set, and it was all pass plays out of the 2 tight end set, which I thought was interesting. Are they playing games with us? They know we're going to put that film out and other people are going to watch it, right? Whatever. But they were actually practicing pass plays out of the 2 tight end set, which we really didn't see a whole lot of, in the past. So,
and when we did see it, it would be a lot of play action, deep shots.
Sure.
Right. We didn't see the quick game, the stuff that we've talked about Notre Dame needing to do out of their offense. It was very run heavy, and then play actions and stuff off, bootlegs off of that.
Right. And look, Notre Dame's going to have to establish the run. I mean, they're not going to be successful doing what they want to do. Yes, you can do RPOs, you can do all of that, but you have to establish the run. You're still Notre Dame, and you still need to be balanced, right?
Yeah.
And so, one of my big question marks going in is what is this run game going to look like with 4 new offensive linemen? Honestly, that's a question mark of mine.
Yeah.
So I think this is a great matchup for Notre Dame in game 1, even if Florida State is better. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt to say that they're better. This is still a great matchup for Notre Dame.
And I think they will be better. I mean, and this is the area we're going to find out, Vince, is how much better are they against the run. You've got a Notre Dame team that's got 4 new starters along the offensive line. Notre Dame team that lost 2 of their top 3 tight ends, right? One thing Javon McKinley was really good at last year, and he was good at a lot of things. But one of the things he was the best at was run blocking.
Yeah.
The receivers were really good run blockers last year. And that led to some of those long runs. Instead of a 15-yard gain, Javon McKinley dominates you, and it's a 50-yard gain kind of thing.
Sure.
So those are interesting matchups. And then you look at this Florida State defense, and we talked about their 2 starting ends are both transfers from the SEC. Jermaine Johnson came in from Georgia, where he was a regular in rotation, and then Kyer Thomas came in from from South Carolina.
Right.
6'2", and Thomas, Jermaine Johnson, 6'5", 260. It's a big boy. That's Isaiah Foskey size, right?
Yeah, right.
Kyer Thomas is 6'2", 275. He is a run defender. He is not he's a Myron Tungavaloa, a Mosa type of guy, right? He's in there to play the run and be strong at the point of attack. They got Robert Cooper inside, who is a monster size-wise. He's 6'2", 338. If he's 338 pounds, that's down a lot from where he was in the past. He used to be listed at like 360, 350, that kind of thing, Vince. So that's he was. I'm looking at their roster in 2018 when he was a freshman, and he was listed at 378.
Oh.
So he's lost some weight. He had some good moments last year at times. He had some good moments in the spring game for Florida State. Yeah, that's a big boy. Fabian Lovett is going to be a new starter for them this year inside. I watched him in the spring game. He's a nose tack or a 3 technique that's 6'4", 310, wears number 0. You know what I mean? Like, that's a guy that thinks he's got some athleticism to him, And so, and then you look at the Dennis Briggs is a complete opposite of those 2 guys. He's like 280. He's a quick, athletic kind of guy. So they're going to have some guys that they can throw at Notre Dame, but are those guys going to actually be more effective? That's going to be the question. And can Notre Dame come out in like you said, can they get a movement against this group? Now, last year, Florida State had those big defensive tackles. They had Robert Cooper, they had Corey Durden, they had Marvin Wilson. Excuse me, I was drawing a blank there. They had Josh Kando on the edge, Janarius Robinson. They had some big defensive linemen. So Notre Dame's strategy was, okay, let's get those big boys moving left and right. And they ran a ton of outside zone against Florida State last year. And it worked. And they just let Chris Tyree and Kyron Williams find some holes. And then they would just quickly hammer them up the middle. And is Notre Dame going to employ a similar strategy? Are they going to be able to be more effective between so that Chris Tyree's one of his long runs was off of like a counter action, right? But again, same thing. Get those guys moving left and right. Don't just try to run right at them and then down blocks and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so that was a really great strategy. Very well designed run game last year. Does Notre Dame kind of try to go back to that? Do we see some different wrinkles? Is this team going to be as good at those concepts as last year's teams were? Those are things we don't know that we're going to find answers to, Vince.
Right.
That's going to go a long way towards determining who wins this particular matchup that we're looking at. Because to your point, you nailed it. Yes, we have talked all summer how Notre Dame's got to get better throwing the ball. They got to throw the ball more efficiently, more explosively, all those kind of things. But if Notre Dame's going to contend for title, they're not going to be a pass-all-day team. They still got to be able to run the football.
Absolutely.
And Florida State, if they're going to be in a bowl game, has to figure out how to try to stop people from running the ball. Again, they don't have to turn into the 1993 Seminoles, right? They don't. They don't have to be the 2013 Seminoles, right? They just have to just not be as bad as they were last year. I mean, if they could just get down to 150 or so, that would be a huge jump. Notre Dame has to make sure that doesn't happen early. I also think this is the area where if you want to talk about how do you get the crowd out of the game early, yes, you take some shots, you complete some passes, but it's you you establish the run and you say, hey, look, y'all, it's 4 different dudes, but nothing's changed.
Right. Yep.
You
Establish
still
the
can't,
trenches.
Yep.
Yeah,
you
I
still
agree.
can't stop us.
Yeah.
You still can't stop us.
So one thing we're going to do when we're doing our stacking up preview here is we're going to decide who has the advantage.
Yeah.
And so the rush offense for Notre Dame versus the rush defense for Florida State. I am going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to give the advantage to Notre Dame. Brian?
Picking some sarcasm in your voice there a little bit.
Never.
Look, I think Florida State's going to be a lot better this year up front against the run, but a lot better means still a middle-of-the-road rush defense. I don't think Notre Dame's going to be as dominant running the ball last year as they were.
Right.
I still think Notre Dame has the edge here. We'll find out if that holds up, but on paper, who they got coming back, how it all works and all that, I still think Notre Dame holds the advantage, not just on paper, but personnel-wise and all those areas.
This is where they were last. This is where they were last year, and it's like this, right? Like they're kind of moving towards each other.
You could probably put Florida State off the screen,
right?
From where they were last year.
I'm being generous, but Florida State's going to get a little bit better. Notre Dame's not going to be quite as good running the football, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing necessarily. But I think they're going to come back just a little bit.
I would say they're not going to be as physically dominant as they were last year.
There you go.
We'll find out if they're still as good. Right. That's the question.
There you go. I like that. Yeah. But there's still this chasm in between.
Right.
So
correct.
That's my point.
Correct. But to your point though, Vince, even if Notre Dame's not as good, if we accept that premise, right? And again, we don't know if it will or won't be. If we're just accepting that premise because of personnel loss, but again, here's the other point too: is it's not about will Notre Dame end up being better in Week 10. This is a Game 1 matchup,
right?
Can we honestly expect Notre Dame to be that good in Game 1?
Absolutely. Yeah,
that's the thing, and that's the point I believe you are making. But yes, still advantage Notre Dame.